Matt Schaff and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to preview Week 12 of fantasy football for you. And Jared, it's probably the strangest week of the entire season because we've got not one, but 3 Thursday games. We've got 1 Friday game this year. So I don't know about anybody watching or listening. I'm going to have to remind myself to make sure that all those Friday players are set in my lineups and that I don't like miss out on somebody because I forgot that there's this Black Friday game. But we're here a little early. We're condensing everything. No waiver show yesterday. This is the preview. It's got some waivers mixed in. We'll talk some trade stuff. We'll talk a little bit about the Thursday games, which we usually lean away from on this preview pod just because of timing. And I think the biggest news for fantasy purposes, arguable, but Mark Andrews, it doesn't get a whole lot bigger than that. Missing the rest of the season for the Ravens. There's a slight chance that he makes it back for the playoffs, but certainly out for the rest of the regular season. So the question I think here is what his injury means for the rest of a Baltimore offense that's been pretty good all season, even if not doing quite as much on the passing side as we hoped heading in. Jared, the first name that immediately comes to fantasy people's minds when Mark Andrews goes down is Isaiah Likely. So why don't we start there? What's your outlook now? What's your thinking on Isaiah Likely for Week 12 and beyond?
Just to give people an idea of what Mark Andrews is leaving behind in his healthy games this season, so Week 2 through Week 10, Andrews accounted for 22.5% of the Ravens targets, 23.6% of the receptions, 27% of the receiving yards, 55% of the team's receiving touchdowns. 6 of the 11 Lamar Jackson passing touchdowns this season have gone to Mark Andrews. So it's a huge hole he leaves behind, a lot of opportunity for these other guys. I do think you're going to see Baltimore shift back towards the run after they kind of opened the season run leaning. They'd been pass leaning for the past month or so. I think they probably shift a bit more towards the run without their top weapon. Isaiah Likely is going to get the playing time, right? I mean, we've seen it this season already. In Week 1 without Mark Andrews, 76% route rate for Isaiah Likely, pretty strong number. 89% of the routes this past game with Mark Andrews leaving on the first possession. But Likely saw 1 target in that Week 1 game and then 2 targets in the Week 2 game. I don't know how much we should be factoring in last year at all, because first of all, it came with a different offensive coordinator. And second of all, the target competition was much weaker, right? I mean, that was one of the worst wide receiver cores in the NFL. They have Zay Flowers now. They have Odell Beckham, who I'm sure we'll talk about here, who's been coming on lately. So, I mean, Likely is worth grabbing because he's going to be on the field a bunch, and because we saw him flash upside last year. To me, he is not yet a top 12 fantasy option. He could get there with a good performance or two, but he's not there yet for me.
Yeah. Likely is definitely worth looking at on waiver wires this week. He is probably worth a claim if you just lost Mark Andrews, or if you've been struggling at the position and are looking for an option. Do not expect him to immediately be a top 12 tight end. Can he get there? Sure. He certainly could do that, because even if we talk about what he did last year with the big numbers that inflated everybody's perception of him, that was a small sample. What he's done this year, which is nothing in 2 games, 1 without Mark Andrews and 1 that he left early, that's a small sample. So we really don't know what to expect from Isaiah Likely so far. And if that's where you start things, then that's a healthy spot to be. The positives, we did see that ceiling that's possible last year. One of those games included Lamar Jackson. The other had Anthony Brown as the quarterback, but Demarcus Robinson was the top targeted wideout in each of those games. Demarcus Robinson and Charlie Kolar were the next 2 Ravens in targets in that season-ending game where Isaiah Likely saw a ton of opportunities. He's got no other career games of 50 or more receiving yards, so we just don't know about him. What we do know is this year, the Ravens have consistently run 4 wide receivers ahead of their second tight end in terms of weekly routes. Now, obviously, Isaiah Likely is in for a huge boost in playing time. He's going to be the number 1 tight end going forward, but if he were a player that the Ravens were completely excited about, thought that they needed to get involved, he would be getting more already with Mark Andrews in the lineup than he has to this point. So he's one of the people that's going to help fill in. But John Harbaugh even alluded to it. They're going to need more guys. They're going to need the wide receivers. They're going to need everybody to pitch in to kind of fill in this void. And I think Obviously the biggest relative bump comes to Likely, but it's a positive for the potential volume for all of the wideouts as well. Zay Flowers, Odell Beckham, even Rashad Bateman. If you play in a deep league, you can maybe stash him and see if something happens, especially with Odell Beckham dealing with the shoulder injury. Just make sure that you don't expect too much from Isaiah Likely right away.
Yeah, the 4 wide receiver thing is interesting too, because I know our buddy Hayden Winks at Underdog did some work. I think it was an off season or 2 ago, looking at tight ends draw less targets or just generally less involved, more wide receivers that are on the field, which makes sense, right? You ideally want your pass catching tight end out there, but just 2 wideouts and another tight end because he's more likely to draw targets. So that's a mark against Isaiah Likely. I will add he gets the Chargers on Sunday night, who are the worst tight end defense by our adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. So I get it in deeper leagues. If you just lost Mark Andrews and you're deciding between, Isaiah Likely and Tyler Conklin, Likely's the play for sure. And, the matchup helps him in that regard. But yeah, Odell Beckham, awesome opportunity here. We got to see about the shoulder, but he had been coming on anyways. And now, all these targets are left over. I think Zay Flowers is a big winner here too. I know he's kind of underwhelmed really lately, especially. And even, for a lot of the season, I think he's been just okay. But you do go back to that week 1 game that Mark Andrews missed. Zay Flowers caught 9 of 10 targets in that game, easily dominated targets. I think he was over a 40% target share in that game. And I think there's a chance, he's, mid 20s to 30% target share going forward, just because I think, he is pretty clearly, despite Beckham's good play recently, I think, Zay Flowers is pretty clearly the best pass catcher on this team now.
Yeah, I mean, Flowers' biggest fantasy issue has probably been fluctuating volume, and losing Mark Andrews should help that volume. Doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be the weekly leader going forward, but it's at least more likely now that Zay Flowers leads the team in targets in any given week. We might even be talking differently about Zay Flowers now if that long catch and run touchdown that he scored against Cincinnati had actually counted instead of being called back by a holding penalty. So he's certainly the upside guy in terms of volume he's been getting so far and what he has showed us on the field. Beckham is enticing because he has played better and been more involved lately. We'll have to watch that shoulder this week. Like you said earlier, we should also expect a bit more Ravens rushing because we already know that they like to do that. We know that they can succeed with that. They've had Keaton Mitchell emerge lately. They continue using Gus Edwards plenty. He continues to have more touchdown upside than pretty much any other running back that has his level of work share any given week. So all those guys get help. Isaiah Likely is interesting, and he could even be startable this week if you're looking in that tight end 15 to 17, 18 range. To me, Isaiah Likely is basically equal to Cade Otton both this week and the rest of the way. The difference between them is Cade Otton has been on the field full time for the Bucs all season. We know he's going to be out there, but he's playing with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. So his targets are going to be up and down every week just because he has better teammates on the field. Isaiah Likely does not have teammates that are that good on the field, does have a team that can run the ball better, and is stepping into a new role. So we don't know what to expect from him yet. So it's like, do I chase the unknown upside? Do I trust the guy that's been on the field more in what's been a decent pass offense?
Yep.
You can pick your favorite. It's okay to go either way.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have Likely not ranked back-to-back in the Week 12 rankings, but it's totally a case of, do you want the safer play with Cade Otton, who, is probably going to give you 3 to 5 catches, 30 to 50 yards, somewhere in that range, or Isaiah Likely, who, could draw 1 target on Sunday night. He could also, draw 8 targets and go for 80 yards. So it's just, do you want the floor, or do you want the ceiling play in Isaiah Likely?
You can check out our weekly waiver pickups article on draftsharks.com now. We got more on both of those tight ends, as well as Odell Beckham and the Baltimore situation. We got other options across positions, of course, including a couple of quiet handcuff running back picks and a dynasty stash at the end of this one. Another big change in the AFC North this week is Pittsburgh firing Matt Canada, the offensive coordinator. So it's undeniably a positive move for the Pittsburgh offense, Jared. I think what we need to do is try to frame it properly. His offenses have stunk. The play calling, the offensive design have probably fed into that. But Matt Canada didn't take an elite quarterback in Kenny Pickett and turn him into the Kenny Pickett that we've seen. So how do we frame this? What does this mean for the offense going forward?
How bad was Matt Canada? This was the first time the Steelers fired a coach in season since 1941. That's how bad Matt Canada was. So listen, I'm not going to pretend to know anything about these new co-OCs and who's going to be calling plays and all that. I also think it's tough for teams to make sweeping changes in season. So, I don't think there's a huge impact here. I do think, it's addition by subtraction though, because Canada was that bad. It kind of, it can't be worse for the Steelers offense and the play calling. It's probably going to be a bit better. The Steelers schedule is what I wanted to talk about here, because Aaron Schatz pointed this out on Twitter, that the Steelers so far this season by DVOA have had the third toughest schedule of all time, since, or at least since DVOA has been tracked, which is a long time. Point is, they've had a brutally 1981. So brutally tough schedule. I looked at that, and then I started looking into our adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers. And by those numbers, so far this season, the Steelers have had the single toughest quarterback schedule, the fourth toughest running back schedule, the second toughest wide receiver schedule, and the second toughest tight end schedule. Going forward now, week 12 through 17, 8th easiest quarterback schedule, 5th easiest running back schedule, 13th easiest wide receiver schedule, 14th easiest tight end schedule. So I'm not saying go invest in Kenny Pickett. I don't even think Pat Freiermuth is going to be someone that we can probably rely on much going forward, but I think the wide receivers are in for an easier schedule, if nothing else. So that can't hurt. Deontay Johnson and George Pickens. I'm interested to see Pickens too, if his usage changes at all, with the new OC, if he, runs a, bigger variety of routes than what he's done in the past with Deontay Johnson on the field. But it's really these running backs that I'm most interested in, because you have the good schedule. This running game has just been good really for the past 4 or 5 weeks. We've seen the Steelers lean toward the run, be a pretty run heavy offense. I think that's going to continue. So, man, it's scary to say, but I really think, I mean, Jaylen Warren, I think anyone would agree, he's kind of like settling in as an RB2 at this point. But I even think Najee Harris is going to be someone that's going to be helpful for fantasy teams down the stretch.
Check our trade targets article and see if any Steelers made it and where they sit in the different sections of that article. I'm curious, I think the running backs are the leading unit of this offense because they rely less on the quarterback actually being good. I might be even a little bit more interested to see if we get any slight lean toward the pass versus the previous, and just kind of better usage. You're talking about George Pickens' routes. If we get better efficiency, there's clearly talent in these wideouts. So I'm curious to see if this change can unlock some of that. Not expecting huge bumps, not chasing after Deontay Johnson or George Pickens this week, but they would be holds for me. And I'm at least a little bit more hopeful now for their rest of way production than I was before this firing.
For sure.
The Packers offense is getting a little bit tougher to be hopeful for, primarily because of all the injuries. First, we had Aaron Jones go down with a knee injury. It sounds like it's not as serious as maybe it could have been. He's listed week to week, not listed, but talked about as week to week. That almost definitely means he'll miss the Thursday game. Possible for week 13. I think you should be planning fantasy-wise as though Aaron Jones is not going to be back for week 13. And Jared, it doesn't seem like it's a serious enough injury to really make it worth stashing somebody like Patrick Taylor or anybody else further down the depth chart than A.J. Dillon.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Taylor is the next man up here because the Packers also lost Emmanuel Wilson to a shoulder injury in that game last week. Taylor had been on the Patriots practice squad. I read that the Packers called him at halftime of their game last week saying, hey, come back. We just lost a couple of running backs. We need you. So in the 3 games Aaron Jones missed earlier this season, A.J. Dillon dominated carries. He had 15, 11, and 20 carries in those 3 games, but he lost passing down snaps to Patrick Taylor. Dillon had just 2 total targets in those 3 games without Aaron Jones. It's funny too, because A.J. Dillon is averaging 2.6 targets per game in his other 7 games with Aaron Jones, but he has just 2 total targets in the 3 games without Aaron Jones. I mean, I think we can project him for like 2 to 3 targets on Thanksgiving, but I do think he's going to continue to lose some, maybe even the majority of the passing down snaps to Patrick Taylor. And then, it's a tough matchup for A.J. Dillon on the ground. The Packers are pretty significant road underdog. So, I mean, Dillon sits just in RB3 territory in our rankings this week. I don't think you want to, trust him or use him as anything more than that.
So A.J. Dillon is not going to eat on Thanksgiving. Luke Musgrave is probably not going to play for a while. Lacerated kidney in that game, landed him in the hospital. He's okay. Sounds like he's likely headed for IR, though, probably missing the next 4 games. So that leaves a hole in a passing game that's been inconsistent, to be fair. And Jaden Reed might be another hole after a game that was, looked kind of breakouty for him. He popped up on Tuesday's injury report with a chest issue. So we're going to have to see exactly who's available for this week 12 matchup with Detroit. And I guess what that means for everybody going forward. If Jaden Reed's out, first of all, Luke Musgrave missing helps the target shares a bit. if Jaden Reed is also out, then you might finally get a Christian Watson week, Jared.
Yeah, I was hoping to get Christian Watson at low ownership in tournaments, but if Reed's out, that's probably not going to happen. But I mean, so start with Musgrave here. First of all, I'm really excited to draft Luke Musgrave this coming offseason, hopefully at a pretty cheap price, because it's been a frustrating rookie year. We know rookie tight ends generally struggle, but I've watched a lot of Luke Musgrave because I have a lot of him in best ball. I've played him a lot in DFS. Jordan Love's just missed him on a lot of potential big plays. Or, there was the one play where Luke Musgrave stumbled over his own feet, and it's just been a frustrating season. He could have scored a lot more fantasy points than he did. So I'm still high on Musgrave, like long term. He's probably a decent dynasty buy at this point now that he's hurt. Tucker Kraft, their other rookie tight end, is going to be the guy on Thanksgiving. Josiah DeGuara, who they also have at tight end, is hurt. He has not practiced yet this week. So it's Tucker Kraft and Ben Sims. I know nothing about Ben Sims, but I think we can feel pretty confident that Tucker Kraft's going to run the majority of the routes. I don't think he's in play in season long, but someone to consider. He's minimum priced on DraftKings if you're playing the Thanksgiving slate. We'll see about Jaden Reed. I saw Matt LaFleur said he hurt his chest on Sunday. They didn't think it was a big deal, but then he showed up to the facility yesterday and it was a bigger deal than they thought. So he does seem like genuinely iffy for this game. Watson and Dobbs would have to get more work if Reed sits. I think they probably already will with Musgrave out. It's a nice matchup too. The Lions are one of the bigger pass funnel defenses. We see teams, lean pass against them. And again, the Packers are big underdogs here. So I do think you should get pretty nice passing volume from Green Bay.
I think any active Packers receiver in this game is somebody that once you get down into like wide receiver 4 range, setting a flex, or even just picking an upside wide receiver 3, they all can make sense. Just know that there's a wide range of outcomes. So when you ask me those questions Thursday morning, I'm basically picking a name out of a hat, just like you are too.
Christian Watson, 24th among receivers in expected PPR points over the last 4 weeks. A lot of deep shots, a lot of end zone targets. They're not connecting. Maybe they will continue not connecting because, again, their deep shots coming from Jordan Love, but the opportunity has at least been there for him.
Yeah. Let's put the opportunity in air quotes because the expected points algorithms do not know exactly what those passes look like. And if a guy is running deep and gets a ball thrown in his general vicinity, it's not exactly the same opportunity as MVS dropping a game-winning touchdown. Rest of way, by the way, like this might be the last week where you can relatively comfortably use somebody from the Packers passing game, because beyond this, the only remaining positive quarterback matchup is Tampa Bay in week 15. They're at the Giants in week 14, which is a neutral spot scoring wise. They're at the Vikings in week 17, another neutral spot. Jared, we've got a couple more games before then, so maybe Jordan Love will change my mind, but he's not currently somebody that I'm comfy betting on in a road spot in the final weeks, even if the defense isn't awesome like the Giants. So, I mean, it's one of those offenses that might put up points, but that it's going to be tough to feel good about using heading into those weeks.
Yeah, I am curious to see how Love plays down the stretch here, because the last 3 games, really looking at his production, even I was looking at PFF grades yesterday. He's been pretty good. He's in the top 10 in PFF passing grade over the last 3 weeks. So he's kind of turned it around. We'll see if he continues that the rest of the way, because the Packers obviously have a pretty big decision to make at quarterback this offseason.
Justin Jefferson has been a weekly decision that has not gone toward putting him back on the field. And one thing to know about him is that his health is more important than your fantasy team, which is obviously true. If you are the person who messages or tweets at or whatever any player about your fantasy team, you're an idiot. We have to wait and see. We don't know yet if Justin Jefferson is playing in week 12. But he's not currently in our week 12 rankings, so we're not expecting it. I think, Jared, even more than the question of whether you play him when he returns, because I think that this patience says that once he returns, you should go ahead and start him because he's probably pretty close to full strength. I think the bigger question is, should you trade Justin Jefferson right now as opposed to waiting for him? And to me, the answer of that really depends on your specific situation as well as your level of risk tolerance. Because if you are fighting to get into the playoffs, he's a pain for you right now. And it might be better to trade off his end of season upside for something that will actually get you to the playoffs instead of keeping him, not making it, and then watching your team score a bunch of playoff points without any matchups.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, generally speaking, at this point, I would lean towards trading for Justin Jefferson. And I don't think he's going to play this week. They have a bye the following week, but I do think he'll be back for, that'd be week 14. And I think, like you said, he should be pretty close to 100% at that point, because the Vikings have obviously played this cautiously. And, Josh Dobbs has continued to play well enough for Minnesota, where I think Jefferson probably will be, somewhere around, wide receiver 5 or so in our rankings the rest of the way. But yeah, it totally depends on your team situation, because like you were saying, I don't think he's going to play this week. There was a tweet from Adam Schefter that made it sound like Jefferson's probably going to be held out again. There's a quote from Kevin O'Connell saying, we want to continue to be cautious. We have this bye upcoming. We have 5 important games after that. It just sounds like they're going to hold him out one more week. So yeah, if you're a team that is on the fringe of the playoffs right now, I think assume you're not going to have Jefferson this week or next, and you probably should trade him to get some points the next couple of weeks. If you're a team that, is in the top 3 in your league and is pretty safe for the playoffs, in that case, I'd be trading for Jefferson, because I do think he could be a big time asset, from week 14 on.
Yep. I had one customer on Discord earlier ask if they should trade Justin Jefferson for Mike Evans or Devontae Adams. I think Mike Evans makes plenty of sense. His bye is gone. Devontae Adams is a little bit iffier because his bye is still ahead, but he does have some positive matchups. He's a higher floor option than Jefferson because he doesn't have a hamstring injury. And then one other was Jamar Chase, who I don't know. I'd be a little hesitant to make that one unless it's just like I need somebody over the next 2 weeks. But even in that case, you might be able to get like Tyler Lockett plus something else as opposed to Jamar Chase. And I don't know how much better Jamar Chase is going to be than one of those Seattle wideouts the rest of the way, if he is going to.
Yeah, I would trade Jefferson for Mike Evans. I don't think I would trade him for Adams or Chase right now.
The Vikings backfield before we get out of Minnesota is interesting, Jared. We've got Ty Chandler, who did play a solid role despite Alexander Mattison making it through the concussion protocol within a week, making it back for the game. What do you make of this backfield going forward? How are you treating it?
Yeah, I mean, Mattison played clearly ahead of Ty Chandler in that game against the Broncos, which surprised me a little after, what we saw the previous week. So the snaps were 64% for Mattison to 32% for Ty Chandler, 51% of the routes for Mattison to just 20 for Ty Chandler. Mattison won 18-10 in carries. Chandler did out target Mattison 4-2, but again, based on the routes, Mattison more than doubling up Chandler. I think, Mattison is the better target bet going forward, assuming this usage sticks. My big takeaway, though, is that the Vikings aren't going to play the Broncos again, who, the defense has improved. The run defense is still one of the worst in the NFL. And, I think that's what made this running game actually productive, for one of the first times this season in that game last week. They're not going to get to play Denver again. I think it's going to kind of go back to being an ineffective ground game. So I think Madison's like an okay running back 3. Ty Chandler's like an okay RB4. I don't think they're going to ascend beyond that without an injury to the other guy.
Yeah, this backfield is not good. It's not a situation where you should be chasing anybody. And I have seen some advice to chase somebody. For the season, the Vikings are tied for 25th in running back PPR points per game. If you take away everyone's running back receiving touchdowns, then Minnesota falls to a tie for 27th. There are only 5 teams in the league that have receiving touchdowns accounting for a higher percentage of their running back PPR scoring than the Vikings do. And only the Vikings, Giants, and Broncos have more running back receiving touchdowns than running back rushing touchdowns on the season. Why do I point out all that? Because we're not predicting running back receiving touchdowns. It's a decent spot for them to get those because Minnesota leans pass and has limited receivers when Justin Jefferson's out. But you can't predict a receiving touchdown for Alexander Mattison or Ty Chandler in any given game. So if that's inflating at all this production that has still been disappointing even with that, then it's just another mark against the Minnesota backfield. So if you have opportunities to sell either of these players for anything meaningful, go for it and don't chase either of them.
Josh Dobbs gets all the rushing touchdowns for the Vikings anyway. So Josh Dobbs, Cortland Sutton, and Gus Edwards continue to break my brain with the rate at which they're scoring touchdowns this season.
Kyler Murray is breaking defenses a little bit, not going crazy, but he has 2 games back from his December ACL tear, 4th among quarterbacks in fantasy points per game on just 1 touchdown pass. And even that came from 48 yards out. So Jared, there's a couple of different ways that you could look at that. You can say Kyler Murray's gotten lucky to score rushing touchdowns each of the past 2 weeks, and maybe he's about to crash because the passing hasn't come along with it. Or maybe the passing takes a little bit longer to work back into form because it's not just one guy making a play. It relies on all the different pieces that go into that. And maybe he's going to produce the same or even better going forward as the passing returns. So what do you make of Kyler Murray, his value, both this week and looking ahead?
Yeah, I think it's probably both. I do expect the passing to improve. I don't expect him to score a rushing touchdown every game. Murray has returned to 2 positive matchups against Atlanta and Houston. You look at his remaining schedule, the Eagles in week 17 are the only top 12 quarterback matchup he's going to face the rest of the way. He has neutral matchups against the Rams, Steelers, and Bears. He has a bad matchup against San Francisco. But, point is the schedule is going to get tougher, at least from a passing perspective, than it's been so far. The fact that he is running, though, is huge, right? He has 13 carries for 84 rushing yards in his 2 games back. So even if the touchdowns stop coming, the fact that he's doing that on the ground, I think is going to probably keep him, right around, fringe quarterback 1 territory for a lot of these games going forward. You obviously are going to want to sit him in that San Francisco game, but I think those other 4 games, around his week 14 bye week, I think Murray's going to be an okay, low end quarterback 1.
Yeah, I think the 2 big negatives remaining on his schedule are that week 14 bye, which obviously leaves you needing another quarterback that week, and then week 15 against San Francisco. We'll see when we get there how much we want to start Kyler Murray in that game, but maybe that's 2 spots where you don't want to use him. I think the upside to that is Kyler Murray has been back for so little time. You're probably not sitting on just Kyler Murray. So you probably have another week-to-week option. You probably have 2 quarterbacks on your roster. I wonder about those games at Chicago and at Philly in the final 2 fantasy weeks. Potential weather in both of those spots. Those are late December games in, cities that could be cold, could be wet, whatever. We'll see when we get there. So I guess maybe that's reason to not necessarily take the numbers of the previous 2 weeks and say Kyler Murray's my quarterback for sure the rest of the way, but he definitely could be your primary quarterback for most of the remaining weeks.
Yeah, I think that's the big takeaway here is you don't want Kyler to be your only quarterback going forward, right? I think you want the option to kind of mix and match him with someone else, based on these matchups the rest of the way.
Kyler Murray has climbed inside the top 12 in our rest of way quarterback rankings. So you can check those to see who he has leaped over. You can see how he stacks up against your other quarterback options. You can also sort by those rest of season projections or rest of season upside in the free agent finder to see exactly how he stacks up against the guys already on your team, other guys on the waiver wire in your league. And then Jared, before we leave the Cardinals, what do we do with these pass catchers now that Kyler Murray's back? To me, Trey McBride's the only guy that I'm truly interested in now.
Yeah, McBride, I think, is locked in as like a top 6 tight end the rest of the way. We still have to see when Zach Ertz comes back. There's been like little on him, so who knows if he's even gonna come back at this point. But if he does, what he does to McBride's role, hopefully he doesn't impact it much because McBride has been awesome. The usage has been awesome. The volume has been awesome. So I think, yeah, he's definitely locked in. Marquise Brown, I don't think anyone's cost me. The only player who's probably cost me more money this season is T. Higgins, because just the 1 week he got hurt, he probably cost me thousands of dollars that week. But outside of T. Higgins, Marquise Brown just continues to crush me because I keep going back to him. Not only has the production been bad the last 2 weeks, but the volume hasn't even been there for Marquise Brown, which is super surprising because the first 9 games of this season, he averaged 8.6 targets per game. You look at his games last year without DeAndre Hopkins, 9.6 targets per game. So I'm still willing to lean into that a bit and say these last 2 games were just sort of, fluky, small sample size stuff. I do think Marquise Brown is still the top wide receiver here in Arizona. I would still be willing to trust Marquise Brown as a wide receiver 3. I was saying he was someone who could be a wide receiver 2 for us going forward. Once Kyler Murray got back, I'm backing off that a little bit, but I still think wide receiver 3 is doable for Marquise Brown.
Yeah, I'm not giving up on Marquise Brown. I think he's fine, but it's getting a bit late to target him in a trade or to say he's going to come back and really help me win a championship. I think what I'm hoping for is that he's a wide receiver 3 the rest of the way, but I also know that he could be wide receiver 4 or worse in a given week. I think he's one where as there's more time back with Kyler Murray, things will get better. It's just that the upside maybe isn't quite as exciting right now as it seemed like 2 weeks ago.
Brown has average target depths of 20.7 and 21 yards over the last 2 weeks. He was at 11.6 yards over the first 9 weeks. And the ADOT stuff in a single game can get thrown off by literally 1 deep shot. So I'm not saying they've stopped using him downfield, but I think part of the reason he's been so unproductive is the fact that he hasn't connected on those deep balls. There was the one in Kyler's first game back where Brown was open for what would have been like a 30-yard touchdown and Kyler just overshot him. So again, it's just stuff like that. If he catches that pass, we're talking about Marquise Brown a lot definitely right now. So I'm still willing to buy into him, even if I'm not as excited as I was, 2 or 3 weeks ago.
And of course, Murray did hit a 48-yard touchdown pass last week, and it was not to Marquise Brown, it was to Rondale Moore. The one target for Rondale Moore in that game made me think that we had last year's issue of when Michael Wilson's out, Rondale Moore gets stuck on the outside, so we have to wait until that's not the case. But that wasn't the case in this one. He was in the slot for his usual amount in the game. It was Greg Dortch playing roughly 2/3 of his snaps outside and getting a bunch more targets than Rondale Moore. So to me, that's a bigger knock against Rondale Moore than it would be if Moore was playing outside in this game.
Yeah, I kind of think it's over for Rondale Moore. I'm kind of done with Rondale Moore. I just don't think it's going to happen for him when you're getting out targeted like that by Greg Dortch. So we'll see if Michael Wilson is back this week. If not, I mean, I do think Dortch is a better fantasy play in week 12 than Rondale Moore.
It sure looks like it. Calvin Ridley is a better play in week 12 than he looked like heading into week 11. But Jared, what do we make of that one? Both what happened there and, of course, more importantly, what do we make of him going forward? Like the one thing that I think most people probably know now is that Calvin Ridley has produced way better when Zay Jones is in the lineup. And heading into that last game, I knew that, but it was the situation where you didn't want to overrate the small sample of games where like there shouldn't be some magic thing about Zay Jones being in the lineup that turns on Calvin Ridley's production. So I didn't want to overrate it for that game. Obviously, the more such games, the more positive games we get with both of those in the lineup, though, we have to factor it in.
We do. I'm still not convinced it's a real thing, though. I mean, the splits are crazy. You know, the with and without Zay Jones splits for Calvin Ridley. I mean, the targets go way up. He's at a 17% target share in games without Zay Jones, a 25% target share in games with Zay Jones, which just does not make sense. Ridley's also been, you know, more efficient, more productive with Zay Jones on the field. I looked into like his deployment too in those games. Like he's not playing in the slot or outside more. That's been the same. His average depth of target hasn't really changed in games with and without Zay Jones. I don't know what it is. Again, I'm still not sure it's actually a thing. I think it might just be random chance that Ridley's had these better games. I mean, last week was Tennessee, who is, you know, one of the better matchups for wide receivers, especially outside wide receivers, which Calvin Ridley is. So like last week, I think it was much more matchup than anything to do with Zay Jones. But it was good to see Ridley have another big game. I still view him kind of the same going forward, where he's probably going to have another big game or two, but he's also not like the alpha in Jacksonville now all of a sudden, where, you know, he's going to continue seeing, you know, these massive target shares and massive games. So I still think he's like a, you know, I don't know, fringe wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, who's probably going to, again, have some, you know, more spike games the rest of the way.
And we're still talking about 4 games that have included Zay Jones before. So now it's 3 that Calvin Ridley has done well. 1, Calvin Ridley did poorly. I mean, we had Zay Jones in week 2 against the Chiefs. Calvin Ridley got 8 targets, caught 2 of those passes. So
in a bad matchup. Again, I think the matchup you're probably,
that was the lone bad matchup among the 4. We've had Indy, you mentioned we had Tennessee, and we had Buffalo in the other one. The Bills, I don't know, at one point were capable of playing good defense, but they haven't done a whole lot of that. And that game was also in England, which can also just change things because it's a whole different travel week than other weeks. So I still don't want to overrate and say if Zay Jones is playing, Calvin Ridley is a star. But I also can't ignore it at this point after what he did last week. I think Calvin Ridley ultimately looks similar to Christian Kirk the rest of the way, as opposed to it being Kirk and then Ridley.
The Jags-Bills game was the Bills' first game of the season without Trey White. So I think it's much more likely that the matchups than Zay Jones making Calvin Ridley better.
And we'll see how much longer we have to make these excuses. Zach Charbonnet is getting his opportunity this week. And I think there are enough people excited about Zach Charbonnet getting an opportunity for it to be a buzzy moment. And for me, Jared, that makes this a week where I want to see what the market thinks of Charbonnet, how much it's expecting. And if I can just go ahead and sell him before we see a game of Zach Charbonnet as starter to either a running back needy manager in my league or the Ken Walker manager in my league.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty excited to see Charbonnet in a big role. So, you know, I'm maybe someone you could sell him to. I mean, I totally get the point. I mean, first of all, we don't know how long Ken Walker is going to be out yet. You know, Pete Carroll's going to be no help there. Honestly, I could see him back next week. I could see him missing, you know, 3 or 4 games. So that's tough here. The schedule for Charbonnet is absolutely brutal. Rest of the season, San Francisco, Dallas, San Francisco again, Philadelphia, one of the best run defenses in the NFL, Tennessee, tough run defense, and then the Steelers in week 17. So there is not a good matchup left on the schedule for the Seahawks running backs, regardless of who they are. I do think Charbonnet with Ken Walker out is going to play an awesome role. I mean, he has already been playing in most of passing situations for Seattle, leading the running backs in pass routes. And I really think he's going to dominate carries because the other guys in this backfield are DJ Dallas, who's, primarily a pass catcher, and then Kenny McIntosh, another rookie who, his biggest calling card is as a pass catcher. So I think you're going to see Charbonnet get Ken Walker level of rushing volume, and then, again, do most of the pass catching work as well.
He should. There's definitely upside, and that path to upside is part of why I would check. I would certainly need a good return. I'm not just giving him away for whatever I can get, because it's quite possible he produces. He looks similar to Rachaad White in that we can't expect efficient rushing, but we should get plenty of opportunities. We've got receiving upside. Yeah. And, whenever you're the featured back, you have a shot to fall into the end zone any given week.
Yeah, I mean, with Charbonnet, it always depends on your roster. If you are a team that was already solid at running back and just, found this new starter in Zach Charbonnet, I think now is definitely a good time to trade him, for an upgrade at another position.
Kyren Williams is also going to get an opportunity to play this week for the first time in a while, coming off of IR. And Jared, here's how good the Rams running backs were while he was out. Darrell Henderson sits number 2 among all Rams running backs in touches for the season. He got dumped earlier this week. He has more receptions per game and receiving yards per game this season than even Kyren Williams does, but he's now unemployed. Royce Freeman is probably still a stronger RB2 than what the Rams had before Kyren Williams' injury. Obviously, they had Royce Freeman on the roster, but he's probably played better than they expected that he would. So I think we'll see more work for Royce Freeman than we did for other Rams running backs before Kyren Williams went down. But I mean, based on what we saw earlier this season, we should also expect Kyren Williams to take this backfield over immediately, right?
Yeah, I think so. The Henderson release was huge for me for 2 reasons. One, it tells us they feel good about Kyren Williams' ankle. I think if they were worried at all, they would have held on to Darrell Henderson. And then 2, because Henderson had been the one doing the pass catching work for the Rams. So I think Royce Freeman is a total zero in that department. So Henderson being gone tells me that Kyren Williams is going to, at least at minimum, step back into the pass catching role. And I do think he'll go back to leading in carries. We'll see if he dominates the way he did the first 3-4 games of the season, post week 1 before he went down. But I mean, I think we're conservatively projecting Kyren Williams for week 12, and he still comes in as like a high end RB2. I think by next week he could be back in our top 10 running backs pretty much weekly.
And this is an offense that has not been throwing the ball as well lately as it did earlier this season. So it might even lean a little heavier on the backfield for rushing and receiving than it did before. So Kyren Williams, I'm glad to see him come back, especially for all my best ball teams. Tony Pollard, did he come back in week 11, or was that an outlier against the league's worst run defense? Jared, what do you think?
I mean, Pollard just kind of produced how he should have according to usage last week for one of the first times. I mean, he actually outproduced usage. He had 15 expected PPR points last week. He scored 18 actual PPR points. Prior to last week, he was averaging 17 expected PPR points per game, but only 12.5 actual PPR points per game. So, I mean, he had an efficient game against a bad Carolina run defense. I mean, I don't feel much different about him now than I did then. Actually, for me, the biggest takeaway from that game last week was that Dallas stayed pass leaning against a run funnel Carolina defense. So that just tells me the Cowboys are going to throw the crap out of the ball the rest of the way, which isn't horrible for Pollard. He can be involved in the passing game. He could be more efficient as a runner if teams are having to worry more about the pass. But I don't think you're going to go back to Pollard getting 20 carries in any of these games the rest of the way.
Stayed pass leaning against a defense that's been a run funnel, and on a day where the passing game wasn't doing a whole lot. They weren't like, all right, fine, let's just run the ball more. They were like, no, we're just going to keep doing this and we'll take what it gives us. And it makes sense. Tony Pollard remains not very good. He's 25th on the season among qualifying running backs in rushing success rate, behind Derrick Henry, Brian Robinson, Josh Jacobs, Kareem Hunt, and AJ Dillon, among others. Tony Pollard is tied for 10th among running backs in targets, tied for 6th in catches, but 15th in receiving yards. And if you look at the 5 targets against the Panthers, you might think, nice, that's a rebound that we need in a category that will help, even if he's inefficient. He had 4 catches for 19 yards. Tony Pollard has not reached 20 receiving yards since week 6 against the Chargers. He has done so in just 3 of his 10 games for the season. He's averaging 2 receptions 8.25 yards per game in 4 weeks since the bye, which followed that Chargers game. And he's had 12 carries in 3 of those 4 games. So he's just a limited workload guy, despite being in a backfield that he's controlling, and he's not efficient. So it was nice that we got a touchdown. I don't think it signals anything as far as expecting more from him going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the touchdowns are the thing that I think can propel him the rest of the way. I do think he could score, 4 or 5 times the rest of the season, just because this offense is so good, and because he's still the one, getting most of those goal line carries.
We'll see. I'd take the under on 4 touchdowns the rest of the way, but
sure,
that's certainly his best path. Finally, we'll go for a streaming defense for week 13. And if you're wondering why we're looking ahead a week, I mean, we've mentioned in recent weeks, Jared, the Dolphins, we mentioned the Lions. Miami is now rostered in 73% of sleeper leagues. You could have found them much more available just a week ago. The Lions, 51%, even though they're coming off a disappointing showing against Chicago last week, they're still on a roster in most places. So what little-known defense do you like a week ahead for week 13?
This exercise is kind of easy at this point. It's just like find the crappy quarterback and, grab the defense playing them. So you have the Rams next week playing Cleveland. We'll see whether it's DTR or Joe Flacco or, back to PJ Walker. Regardless, it's going to be a bad quarterback. So I think the Rams are an okay start. And then I think I actually prefer Atlanta against the Jets, whether it's Tim Boyle or Zach Wilson. I think they have Trevor Siemian too. I just found out this morning. So again, it's going to be a bad quarterback. And I think the reason I prefer Atlanta is because I just think that the Browns will be able to go pretty run heavy against the Rams, I think, whereas the Jets, might be forced to throw it against Atlanta. It's actually one of the craziest things of this season to me is that the Jets are one of the pass heavier offenses in the NFL this season. Like, they have a high neutral pass rate. They're above pass rate over expected, which makes 0 sense to me. But if that continues with Tim Boyle under center, then, these defenses facing the Jets are going to have huge upside.
I wonder just how often they've actually been in neutral situations and whether that throws those calculations off. Because, I mean, they've been trailing most of the time. So I like Tampa Bay picking them up this week because they are just 18% rostered on Sleeper, 29% on Yahoo. So they're plenty available. They've got Carolina in week 13, second best scoring matchup for fantasy defenses by our adjusted fantasy points allowed. They are at Atlanta the week after that, 5th best scoring matchup. So you've got one that you can pick up not just for week 13, but also week 14.
Like that. 376 neutral snaps for the Jets this season. They are 60% pass in those on those snaps, which is 8th highest in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
Make that make sense to me.
They spent a decent amount of the year with Breece Hall, working him back slowly, but they've also had him back to full strength or whatever, close to full strength recently. It also means that they have been a little disappointed with what they got in Dalvin Cook after signing him. Check out the Free Agent Finder, our updated Rest Away rankings, our updated Dynasty rankings. If you're looking beyond this season and trying to improve your team for next year, we've got you covered on all fronts. We've got our trade targets for the week, and we will have Jared's and Kevin's picks for the Thanksgiving Day DFS slate available on draftsharks.com. We're here to help you win this week, this season, and beyond.